right, so this lecture is going to be about evolution, which is a really important concept because it sort of intertwines with genetics and ecology and a lot of the other things that we've talked about this year. So we're going to start by talking about Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection. So Darwin is sometimes called the father of evolution. Most people, when you think of evolution, you think of Darwin. There were other people that had theories around the same time as him, but his theory about natural selection really makes the most sense, and it's sort of the groundwork for what we believe today. So the first thing that Darwin said is that genetic variation exists in members of a population. So those variations are already there. So you may have a population of birds, and some have very long wings, and some have very short wings. Or maybe you have fur that ranges from dark colored to light colored, etc. So there's genetic variation. That's step one. Next, more offspring are born than survive and reproduce. Meaning, just because an organism has babies doesn't mean every baby is going to grow up to become an adult and then reproduce and make more organisms. For example, think about sea turtles. Sea turtles lay all of those eggs, but then how many of those hatch, and how many of those hatchlings make it to the water? And then just because they make it to the water, how many of them get eaten by predators, etc.? And so how many of those, 100 eggs actually become an adult sea turtle? There's also competition. So if every sea turtle did survive, they would run out of food. There's going to be competition for basic needs, food, water, shelter, or even mates. And so the idea is that organisms with adaptive characteristics, meaning that they are better suited to their environment, are going to tend to survive longer and reproduce more than those with less favorable characteristics. So if having long wings gives you an advantage as a bird, you're going to be more likely to live longer and have more babies. And because that trait of longer wings was genetic, you're going to tend to pass that on. And so over time, more and more individuals in the population are going to have that characteristic. So that's the concept of natural selection. Also keep in mind, and I know I've told you this word before, fitness. Fitness is a measurement of how much you contribute to the next generation. It's not physical fitness like you think of in a health class. Fitness, organisms that are considered fit are organisms that are having lots of babies. They're passing on their genes, so those genes can become more common. Now, a couple of important things that I want to point out to you here, because there's a couple of rabbit holes that people fall down on the AP exam, because these are sort of common misconceptions. So first of all, traits don't come about on purpose in response to something. So it's not like, oh, it gets really, really cold, so humans are going to evolve fur. It doesn't work that way. If it gets really, really cold, then either humans that already have hairy bodies survive better, humans that store fat survive better, humans that are, for whatever reason may survive better, but we don't evolve a trait on purpose in response to a particular event. Second, traits don't disappear just because you don't use them anymore. So it's not like, oh, well, if we don't use our pinkies, I bet, several thousand years from now we won't have pinkies anymore. They don't get smaller because you don't use them. That doesn't make any sense. Often a trait is a compromise. Keep this in mind. The ability to walk upright means our hips are shaped in a particular way. The benefit, we can go much faster, on the ground, walking upright, than say chimps or gorillas maybe, who don't. But on the flip side of that, it makes our hips a particular shape that we need to give birth at a particular point, or the baby would get too big and wouldn't be able to fit out of the mom. So there's a compromise there, where a trait allows us to do one thing, but then may be a drawback in another way. And evolution is not directed toward a goal. So we're not striving to perfection. If that was the case, humans would have evolved better hearing and better vision and faster, movement, etc. Evolution is a result of mutations that happen, natural selection, and a bunch of other things that we're going to talk about in this chapter. But we sort of are working with traits that happen to exist. Traits don't come about on purpose so that we can become perfect. Common AP examples, antibiotic resistance. This one comes up a lot, where they'll talk about mosquitoes becoming pesticide resistant or bacteria becoming antibiotic resistant. Keep in mind that they don't become resistant because they're exposed. Oh, because we spray for the mosquitoes, they learn how to become resistant to that particular pesticide, and now it doesn't work anymore. No, some mosquitoes had to already be resistant. If there weren't already mosquitoes that were resistant, they all would have been killed. And the same with bacteria. You have a few bacteria that already happen to have resistance genes. So when you take the antibiotic, you kill off all the other bacteria, and now the ones that were already resistant are going to become more common because they have no competition. So the next time you take that antibiotic, it's not going to work. But they don't become resistant after they're exposed on purpose so that they can live. It doesn't work like that. And like cavefish, why are cavefish blind? Common misconception they're going to throw on the AP exam. One of the choices is going to say, oh, well, because they didn't need their eyes anymore, their eyes became smaller and eventually became useless. No, it doesn't work like that. Perhaps there were mutations where the eyes were lost or became smaller, and that mutation was a benefit in some way. Maybe it heightened their other senses. And so therefore, that was a beneficial trait, and it got passed on. So traits do not appear because they're needed. They don't disappear because they're not used. So keep that in mind. Very, very important. All right, jumping back to natural selection. Natural selection can sort of be subdivided into 3 different types. The first one is called directional selection. So directional selection is where one extreme is favored. What do I mean by an extreme? Well, like in this case with the moths, one extreme would be that they're very light speckled moths, and the other extreme would be that they're very dark. Now, originally, this is sort of a textbook example that they often use, something called industrial melanism. The idea is that the original population of moths was mostly these light ones, which makes sense because you can see that they blend with the trees really, really well. But when the Industrial Revolution happened in England, the trees became darker because it killed off this lichen that grows on the trees, and so the bark became darker, and therefore the moth population followed. The moth population became darker. Again, not because the light moths turn dark. If you're a light moth, you're just a light moth. And, you know, if you get caught by birds, you get caught by birds. But there were already some dark moths in the population. Now, originally that wasn't favorable because the light moths were more camouflaged. But once dark moths were more favored, they were the ones surviving, having more offspring, and so the population shifted in a single direction. So this is why it's called directional selection. So this would be any time you see an original graph and then a new graph of the same population, 50 years later or whatever, and the population shifts to the left or shifts to the right. Maybe taller is better, darker is better, whatever. That's going to be directional selection. Now today, the moth population has shifted back to the original because we don't have the pollution that existed in 19th century England, and so the trees have returned to their original color. All right, the second one is stabilizing selection, which is what it sounds like. The population stays stable. This is where heterozygous is favored or average is favored. So you have the extremes. In this case, a very common example of this one is the correlation between the sickle cell gene and malaria. So if you're big B, you do not have sickle cell. If you're big B, little b, you are a carrier of sickle cell. My understanding is there may be some mild symptoms. And if you're little b, you have sickle cell. Now, having sickle cell can be deadly. So you don't really want to have sickle cell, particularly if you live in some remote area of Africa where there's not going to be medical care. Chances are you're not going to live as long as other people. But what we discovered, you would think the gene would have been wiped out. It was not wiped out. In fact, I want to say, 50 or 60% of people in certain areas of Africa are carriers of this sickle cell allele. And what they discovered was there was a benefit to being heterozygous because it gave them resistance to malaria, which is carried by mosquitoes. And malaria can also be deadly. And so what we see is areas of Africa where there's a high incidence of malaria carrying mosquitoes, there is a high incidence of people carrying the sickle cell gene. Sometimes this is called a heterozygote advantage. This is another example of it. So these are gall flies. This graph is showing gall flies. So wasps eat the small ones, and woodpeckers eat the larger ones. And so the average size flies are favored. And so this would be an example of stabilizing selection. Another one I've seen them discuss on the AP exam is birth weight. That average birth weights are favored. Babies that are too small or too large tend to have a higher infant mortality. This is the infant mortality, the red line here. And so it's favorable to be average. So that's stabilizing, which makes sense, keeps things stable. So directional shifts in one direction, can be left or right, stabilizing in the middle. And then last is disruptive selection. So imagine we have a population of rabbits, and we have from very light to very dark. Something changes in the environment, or perhaps these sort of get split into two kind of diverse environments, where one is very dark and one environment's very light. Well, if you're a dark rabbit or a light rabbit, you would be able to camouflage, but if you were a medium color tan rabbit or light brown rabbit, you don't blend. You don't blend with the light sand, you don't blend with the dark leaves, you stand out no matter where you go. Well, what's going to happen is these middle ones are going to be the ones that tend to get eaten by predators, and so these can actually become two separate populations, and over time, it's possible they can diverge from one another so much that they no longer mate, and they are now two separate species. And this is called divergent evolution. So if we see a population split in two, that's divergent evolution, and that would be an example of disruptive selection. So both of the extremes, very light, very dark, are favorable. Average is the worst scenario here. All right, quick reminder from our previous chapter, we talked briefly about this. Convergent evolution is where two organisms happen to develop similar characteristics but are not evolutionarily related. Divergent evolution, the two organisms actually share a common ancestor but have split into separate species. So two different things. Make sure you know the difference. This is an example of divergent evolution that's commonly given. This is the flightless birds. So the different flightless birds we think originated from a single species, and then during the breakup of Pangea, they were separated onto different continents, and depending on where they ended up, different characteristics developed through mutations and natural selection, etc., because the terrains were different in South America versus Africa versus Australia, and so you end up with all of these different species of flightless birds. Artificial selection, make sure you just know what it is. This is where man chooses traits. Very obvious example would be all of the breeding that we've done to get different domesticated dogs. This is showing chickens, 1957. This is a 56-day-old chicken. 2005, this is a 56-day-old chicken. So, and this is not GMOs, this is not genetic manipulation, this is just us crossbreeding specifically to get traits we wanted. Same thing here. This is what corn originally was like, but through crossbreeding, again, not genetic manipulation on a molecular level, but just crossbreeding for traits, we've been able to get modern corn. So that is artificial selection. All right, how do we study evolution? So there's a lot of ways that we can look at evidence of evolution. The first one is the fossil record. This will give us relationships between organisms, where they're located, what kind of anatomy. This would tell us, when were the first vertebrates around? When did we start seeing fossils appear on land, etc. How do we know how old fossils are? Well, one way, this is just showing the modern horse, and you can see how the number of toes has been modified. Again, mutations in the natural selection over long periods of time have led to the modern day horse. One way we know the age of fossils is radioactive isotopes. They break down at a particular decay rate. So for example, this one, strontium 90, breaks down, its half-life is 29 years. So if we start with a certain amount, 10 grams, when 29 years go by, half of it is gone. So now it's 5 grams. Another 29 years, half of that is gone. And different isotopes have different half-lives. So carbon-14 has a half-life of almost 6,000 years. Uranium-238 is another one we use. And so we can look at how much has decayed to figure out the age of fossils. We can also look at depth in the ground. Deeper is going to tend to be older. And things called index fossils, which are kind of widespread fossils that we already know the age of. Comparative anatomy is looking at similarities in the anatomy of organisms. So, for example, homologous structures, which are similar structures in different animals coming from a common ancestor. I gave you the example of bones. It doesn't have to be bones, but that's a common one in the flipper of the whale and the wing of the bird. Vestigial structures, those that are no longer used, such as the small wings of some birds, or our appendix, or our tail. Remember that analogous structures not evolutionarily related, just similar in